Welcome to Season 3, Episode 12 of the Volvo Rescue. There's a little bit of crossover here between the previous episode with some of the parts installed on the firewall, like the brake pedal, gas pedal assembly, the clutch master cylinder, and the wiper motor. But this episode is dedicated entirely to the wiring harness. It seems like madness, but I actually had quite a bit of fun. So tag along, and here we go. The kit from VP comes fully loomed, fully grommeted, and everything's ready to go. And I have my own supplemental wiring harness diagram here that I did buy. It's laminated. It was like $17 or $18 on eBay and worth every penny. The wiring is pretty simple if you follow along. There's only like 6 colors on this entire thing, but everything's cut to length and the ends are terminated, so I have a pretty good idea of what goes where. But that being said, this process was about 2 days of work, and we're going to try to cover it all in about 20 minutes. Let's get this party started. It's another morning, and there's the old wiring harness. Still has a lot of the accessories attached to it, which is nice. The new wiring harness is halfway in the car. The other half is right here. This is a weird harness. I'll have to review what part number it is and what year exactly I bought, because there's a lot of connections that are different. I mean, all the wires are the same and the colors seem to be the same, but there's just stuff that's like not in sheathing as much as the other harness, or the fact that it comes with a baggie of connectors, which means you have to do a lot more work to finalize some of those connections or join them together, such as the headlights. And I think my theory is, well, let me show you what I'm talking about. If you look here, all of our red wires for the headlights, they're incomplete. And I'm wondering if there were different kinds of headlight assemblies or like bulb styles or bulb sockets that were different and they required you to reuse the old part, or if they were not sure which part exactly. Anyway, we'll figure all that out as we approach. I'm going to be working on wiring today. So as I mentioned earlier, all of the firewall stuff gets installed 1 episode ago. I put the link down in the description. And then after that, the dashboard gets put in place, and the majority of the wiring will happen with the dashboard in place. It's kind of useless to do it without. It does go above and below the steering column. It kind of wraps around both ways. I have Genevieve next to me so I can reference exactly what that looks like. But still, there's a lot of places where I'm filling in the blanks based on previous experience or just what makes sense. The steering shaft was a little tricky. There's 2 springs that keep that center column piece that I'm about to attach. But first, the gauge cluster gets fit into place. Restoring the gauge cluster is $1,500 to have that professionally redone, which will happen at a later time. But it's good to know it can come out at any time once you wiggle around a few things. But that center column, boy, was that a real pain in the butt. Genevieve's was a little bit worse because there was some weird modification done to it, but this one here was pretty straightforward, and it gets all cinched down into place. There's a big rubber piece that holds it in, but tightening down the nut will get it to seat kind of where you need it to be. Not a lot of play there, but it should be pretty far in, and still have a little bit of wiggle room. There's about 4 or 5 different wires that connect to the turn signal switch, and then I'm going to be adding an overdrive switch. But this shroud gave me a little bit of trouble. There was some screws that didn't want to go in, or I was missing hardware, and it won't be for the last time because I spent a lot of time just hunting for hardware as I was putting everything back together. The funny thing to note about this wiring harness, as I mentioned earlier, the diagram is invaluable, and you also want to keep a multimeter around with the ohm meter, especially if you have one that just beeps at you, so you can quickly terminate wire ends and find out exactly which one begins where and where it ends, because you don't have striped wires, you don't have different special shaped connectors. You can mix things up, although it's more or less straightforward. It's mostly when you're pinning out those square connectors. I think there's 3 or 4 major ones for the rear tail lights, the front headlights, and the junction block underneath the dashboard. That's the one that you saw hanging down on the leftmost side before the dash was in place. This harness for Bruce I have no idea what I did here. What did I do wrong? Because it does not make sense. It's entirely, I mean, it's mostly there, but there just seems like there's a lot of extra stuff. And I have no idea what's what. So I'm gonna have to start with my process of elimination, beginning with what I know, make all those connections with my tape so I can at least identify everything. And then once I'm confident that I've got the right connections to the right things, I'll figure out what all these extra harnesses are for. For example, the one that caused me some great confusion, this guy. There's not a lot of yellow wires in my diagram, so I was like, oh, okay, this looks like it goes right to the, it's got 2 blacks and a yellow and a white. Obviously the light switch, because that's what the diagram is showing me. What's this red one? It could be the light switch too. There's 3 reds that go on it, and it's got an extra terminal here, but what's this black one? I don't know, there's nothing that I can tell on the diagram there, but then where does it go? All right, that's fine. However, the yellow wire on our diagram goes right to the foot dip switch for the high beams, and as you trace out the other yellow wire, that's where it goes. And I'm like, okay, well then what is this harness? It's got a grommet. Okay, so what's the grommet for? Somewhere in the firewall, there's a harness coming through and attaching really close, and I just have no idea. So that could be some relays up front or something else, but yeah, no, I don't think that's it. I really don't. So I just put everything aside, I do what I know so far, and then see what's left over and try to fill in the blanks. It's like starting with a puzzle using the corner pieces because you know those ones. So I found out my issue. I ordered harness number 243, which is listed in VP's catalog as the harness for the 120/130 1969 to 1970 B20s. Look, this isn't going to be all that interesting, so instead of watching me for a while, why don't I just take you to watch the sunset? Because if you look very closely, there's a rainbow. So since my harness was for a 120 in the years 1969 to 1970, that was after they finished production in the United States, and I think it was just Canada and the rest of the world remaining. So whatever extra lights, extra accessories, extra, I don't know, overdrives or different wiring to different components they had, this harness has that. Thankfully, things like the gauge cluster stayed the same, so I didn't get out of luck too much there. This little connector, oh my goodness, it was just such a pain in the butt. The issue here is that there are several spots in this connector where the spade terminals need to be half thickness because 2 wires will go into 1 slot. On Genevieve, that harness was made perfectly, but for some reason the supplier of this harness used the full thickness of the spade terminals, not the width, it's the thickness of each male spade, and it didn't fit. So I had to modify it and just really fight to squeeze it in there, and eventually I got it, but it was too much. Oh my goodness, I must have been, every area on this car where I'm saving time because of the familiarity, I just did everything on Genevieve. I seem to be losing that with some of the differences in the parts. What I mean by that is the terminals that need to connect to that square connector right up there. As you saw, it took an hour just to get those 3 wires inside of that connector because the spade terminals that they gave me are thicker than the ones from the factory and the ones from the harness that went into Genevieve, which meant sandwiching up 2 connectors into 1 terminal. I had to carve out the connector and I had to sand down the terminals to make them just a 1/2 millimeter thinner, and then squeeze them in and keep trying without mutilating the connector, without cutting and splicing the harness into one, which I considered, but I wanted to stay original, and if it just meant a little bit of reaming out the plastic, it's a lot harder than it sounds, let me tell you. But thankfully it was just 3, and now we can move on. And I know what I'm up against when I'm sandwiching those connectors, depending on the harness. I'm not sure if it's the brand of the harness or, because this one has a lot more of those brass or gold color terminals versus the one that went into Genevieve. Not to mention the insulation's all different. The colors are more or less the same so far, but there's a lot of differences in these 2 harnesses. All right, moving on. Okay, I'm going to show you now the wiring, the way that it came. There was just these little guys here. Thankfully, they're all taped together, and then I just put a zip tie just to make sure that the tape doesn't come apart. And I've clipped these ring terminals together because they're both going to go on the fuel gauge. Hang on, Dave. all I'm really going to do is just take, I mean, this harness, it's uncut, thankfully, but it's really in no shape to take from because it's so old and dried out. I've got a spare harness from a junkyard car many years ago that I found. It was that white Amazon that had all the tribal paint on it. I tried getting the windshield, but I broke it. Anyway, it's got this. And the funny thing is just the routing of all these wires because, you know, this is the main loom, unfortunately, cut. But it goes there, and so you've got a red wire coming out from one section of it, looping all the way back into the other section. A little confusing, but one of them goes to the oil pressure sender, which is the output of the circuit, so to speak, and then the other side is battery positive over at the starter, not the starter, the alternator or generator. Now all I've got to do is just cut both ends of this from this harness here, take what I need, and that should be it. There's only two lights. One's the oil pressure light and the other is the charging indicator light. So as you see, it's really not that difficult to piece the harness together. I think the most challenging part is just routing everything because it does look kind of crazy underneath the dashboard, the way it goes over the steering column, under the steering column. Things make sense. You just connect all your switches, follow the wires, trace everything out. Pretty straightforward, and having a diagram like this just goes such a long way. It's kind of impossible without, I would say. What is that green wire? Well, unfortunately, I don't have the correct ignition right now, and the coil has been cut. It's got a spade terminal on it, so in the meantime, I will use this right here, just to get us going. This is the flasher, emergency flasher. It's not a Volvo part, it's aftermarket. It screws into the bottom of the dashboard, and I just happen to like it so much, and it just reminds me fondly of the previous owner that I believe I'm gonna keep it, because it just looks pretty good the way it's mounted up. Two holes right there, so I think it'll match nicely. And for 1962, they didn't really have flashers. They were only accessories like this, aftermarket. Later years, as we know, have the flasher hole up here, and then the overdrive light was right there. And then the later years had an overdrive switch somewhere, one of these guys. This is too close to the column, but we do have a column-mounted overdrive switch. It's a little unfair that I'm not going into much detail on certain connections when you're installing the wiring harness. It's easy enough for me to say, oh, it's pretty straightforward. Once you're under the dash, you'll figure out what to do. But on Genevieve, which I did actually prior to this, that's why it's a little bit backwards here. I did the harness on Genevieve a week or two before this video was shot, so I had an idea of all the connections. The information was fresh in my mind, and I knew what to expect. That being said, this clip here, this time-lapse section for about 30 seconds of your viewership is 3 hours and 45 minutes of actual work under the dash. And if you are doing the work correctly, at the end of it, you shouldn't see any wiring. And it was a little disheartening, so what I decided to do is after finishing and tidying up all of my connections, I brought the steering wheel out as well as the dash pad, and I just placed them in so that at the end of the day I could look at the dashboard and everything and think that I actually made some work, some progress. Knowing underneath all that work is finished is a big relief, but sometimes you just need a small visual cue to make your work feel a little more worth it. Started the day with an empty dashboard. I thought it was only 2 a.m., but it's 4:45 in the morning. That means that last video, that last 30 seconds was 3 hours and 45 minutes of work. What? Time flies, especially when you're like, oh, I'm so close, and then you find 7 other things. And I have the issue where I start, and then I get distracted because I see another problem that needs fixing. I'm like, oh, let me connect this wire. Oh, that's right, I need to find some hardware. Let me go dig in the box for some hardware. Oh, that's right, I gotta go back and splice a few things. Where did this gray wire go again? And then you end up not wasting a lot of time, but potentially it could waste a bit of time. Cool, I got work in 5 hours. Let's see how that goes. Lots of coffee, I tell you what. Anyway, started out with no dash, just a blank firewall, and ended the day by placing the dashboard on top and sticking the wheel on the spokes just for the pictures. Well, it was a productive day. There's 2 accessory wires that are just extras for this harness, and I still have all of that. No idea what that is. No idea. Like, that's the generator wire over there. Just the 4 wires. But over here, what is all that? I have no idea. I've got my overhead stuff. I'm going to take a look in the taillight section and make sure I'm not skipping anything. Also, the ignition is not Volvo OE, as you could tell by the blue coil wire from the bottom. You see that little blue connector? Yeah, that's going to get changed, but I wired it up so at least we can get the car driving, and I put a little plastic washer on the back. I just cut one out of a container that was in my recycle bin because I wanted it to be preventing any scratches. A few lessons that I learned. If you think it's going to scratch, it's going to scratch. And if you don't think it's going to scratch, it's still going to scratch. Thankfully, all those little scratches are underneath the dashboard, but oh my goodness, was that frustrating. And all the surfaces that you see and do touch are clear coated. The surface underneath the dashboard, not so much. So I get it. The last point I want to make before wrapping this video up is the jute firewall blanket. It's going to require me to remove the pedals. It's going to require me to unbolt almost every accessory from the firewall, which is a bit of a step backwards, but you know what? It's worth it in getting the car drivable so we can at least have it delivered to California and then continue all the work out there. All right, one of my favorite little things is just this little map light switch here. Okay, I lied. One more thing I want to say. Regular male spade terminal, okay, for the door switch on the passenger side. And then you reach the driver's side. The other harness got this right, but why on earth do I have a female spade? That makes 0 sense. Okay. These are the 2 extra wires I was talking about. One's black, one's brown, and they end on the other side of the trunk. So if I ever want to run an accessory, now I have my wires run for it. And the flasher. It's connected exactly the way it was in the past. Instead of having those like tee-off wires, you know, that would connect sort of in line like that. Little shark's teeth that would just bite into a wire and get a connection from it. Instead of doing that, since I had to splice in the socket for the bulb for the turn signals, and that's where that was tied in on the old harness, that's how I did it this time, and I shouldn't have any problems. So it's really kind of exciting to me to see all of this coming together. Good night, and thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. Like the video, give it a thumbs up. See you next time. Oh, I didn't latch. I just put you on. What's squeaking? Don't you go squeaking on me. You're a new door.